I held the envelope with steady hands, even as my heart rattled inside my chest. A bill. On my birthday. Rent. Utilities. Groceries. My own children had priced out my existence in their home like I was a stranger off the street. But what they didn't know was that I had every receipt, every sacrifice, every sleepless night tucked away. And if they wanted numbers, I was ready to show them the cost of an entire childhood. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Janet Collins had always believed birthdays should feel a little warm, a little sentimental, even if the cake came from a grocery store and the candles sputtered out halfway through, "Happy birthday." But this one, the 68th, sat in her chest like a paperweight, heavy and oddly out of place. The dining room looked as it always did on family night, overly bright with the overhead pendant lights casting a yellow sheen over everything. The table was set for five, with mismatched wine glasses and ceramic plates that Sophie had picked up from a clearance rack years ago. The smell of baked ziti hung in the air, layered with garlic bread and store-bought Caesar salad. Janet smiled politely as she stepped in, even though no one had bothered to ask what she wanted for dinner. "There she is," Mark said, lifting his wine glass in an almost lazy salute. The birthday girl. He wore one of his work polos, the logo on his chest slightly faded, and that familiar half-smirk that always seemed to suggest he knew something everyone else didn't. Sophie came over and gave Janet a brief hug, warm but distracted, like she was thinking about something else. "You look nice, Mom," she said softly, tucking a loose strand of her hair behind one ear. "Happy birthday." "Thank you," Janet replied, brushing a wrinkle from her skirt as she took her seat at the far end of the table, her designated spot ever since she'd moved into Mark's guest room last fall. She glanced at the place setting in front of her. No gift, but there was a plain white envelope tucked next to her water glass, the only item on the table that didn't seem to belong. Her eyes lingered on it for a second, then she picked it up and turned it over. No name, just sealed. "That's from us," Mark said, stabbing a fork into his ziti. "Figured we'd keep things practical this year." Janet's thumb slipped beneath the flap, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a neatly folded letter. No handwriting, just printed text in blocky black font. She unfolded it slowly. "Room and board invoice room, $800 per month. Utilities, $200 per month. Groceries, $200 per month. Total you, $1,200 per month. Effective immediately." Janet didn't blink. She read it twice, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper before relaxing again. Her eyes skimmed the bottom, where someone had bolded the total. There was no note, no signature. Mark leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the envelope like it was a helpful spreadsheet. "I mean, with inflation and everything, you know. It's not like we're asking for much, just trying to keep things fair." Sophie looked down into her lap, her fork untouched. "We just talked about it the other day," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a hard year for everyone." Janet folded the paper carefully, creasing it along the lines, then placed it back inside the envelope. She pressed the flap closed as gently as if it were a sympathy card. "Of course," she said, with a thin smile, her voice calm. "Fair is fair." Neither of them noticed the pause that followed, the slight chill that drifted in where the warmth of the birthday should have been. Mark took another bite of ziti, nodding like a man satisfied with a job well done. Sophie busied herself with refilling everyone's water glasses, her hands unsteady, but determined not to show it. They sang "Happy Birthday" 15 minutes later, off-key and half-hearted. The cake was chocolate, Janet's favorite when she was 42, but not something she'd asked for in over a decade. She blew out the candles, offering no wish. That night, long after the dishwasher had finished humming and the rest of the house had gone quiet, Janet sat alone at the small wooden desk in her room. The same desk she had bought when Mark was 10, back when he still left sticky jam fingerprints on everything. She pulled open the bottom drawer and reached past old envelopes and tax documents until her fingers found the thick manila folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside were decades of details: medical receipts, orthodontist bills, summer camp registration forms, grocery ledgers from when she raised 2 kids on one part-time salary, and a second-hand station wagon. Janet exhaled through her nose, steady and quiet. She pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer, its top page blank and full of possibility. She wrote the first line slowly. Diapers and formula, 1979 to 1982, 4,512. Then the second, school supplies, books, uniforms, 1985 to 1997, 8,300. She paused, tapped the pen once against the desk, then kept going. This time, each number came easier than the last. The next morning, Janet stood at the kitchen counter in her robe, slowly stirring a pot of oatmeal she had no intention of eating. The sun had barely climbed past the neighbor's roof, casting a soft amber glow through the blinds. From the living room came the muffled sound of cartoons, Sophie's youngest already planted in front of the television. Mark had left early, his coffee mug still sitting half full in the sink. Sophie hadn't said goodbye. Janet's hands moved mechanically. Stir, tap, stir, tap. Her thoughts weren't on breakfast. They were still back in the envelope, in the $1,200 judgment, in the way Mark's voice had carried the confidence of a man who truly believed he was doing the right thing. She turned off the stove and left the oatmeal there, untouched. By mid-morning, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor of her small bedroom, surrounded by open boxes and folders that smelled faintly of ink and time. The air was thick with dust and memory. Her glasses slid to the tip of her nose as she carefully unfolded a yellowed receipt from a pediatric dentist. $1,180 for braces. Marks, in 1991. She wrote the figure down on her pad and circled it twice. Another folder held a faded copy of Sophie's college tuition bill. Janet stared at it for a long moment, remembering how she'd worked an extra bookkeeping job on Saturdays to make sure it was paid without loans. The amount was staggering, almost half of what she'd earned that year. She wrote that one down too. There was a soft knock at the doorframe. Jesus, Janet. Did a filing cabinet explode in here? Janet looked up, smiling faintly. Trish, you're early. Trish Miller stepped into the room, looking just as she had 20 years ago. Sharp eyes, cropped silver hair, and a voice that could cut glass if she felt like it. She bent down, peering at the papers spread out on the floor. You making scrapbooks or building a lawsuit? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Janet handed her the rent invoice without a word. Trish read it silently, then looked up, her face stiffening. You've got to be kidding me. Nope, Janet said simply, going back to her sorting. Birthday surprise. Trish stared at her for a beat, then exhaled through her nose in a long, low whistle. They really sent you a bill. Unbelievable. Janet pulled another receipt from a manila envelope. Mark's emergency room visit at age 10. Broken arm. $742 and a ruined weekend. She added it to the list. If they want bills, she said, her tone steady, then I'll show them bills. Trish sat down beside her, carefully navigating between scattered statements and records like stepping through a minefield. You're about to write the invoice of the damn century, she muttered. Janet let a small smile form at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes stayed focused. I'm not angry, she said, almost more to herself than to Trish. I just want it all down. Every receipt, every hour, every choice I made that wasn't for me. She lifted a notebook from the pile and flipped to a page dated 1995. Insurance premiums, co-pays, soccer cleats, therapy sessions, yearbook fees. She hadn't even realized she still had it. This is therapeutic, she said after a moment. I thought it would make me more upset, but it's the opposite. I feel... She paused, searching for the word. Clear. Trish shook her head, half in admiration, half in disbelief. You've always had a ledger brain. You kept all this for what? Nostalgia? No, Janet said, adding a new line for Sophie's driving lesson. I kept it because I was the only one paying attention. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound being the shuffle of papers and the scratch of Janet's pen moving across the legal pad. She didn't rush. Every figure had to be accurate, every detail accounted for. This wasn't just a list. It was a record of everything she had given, freely, without expectation, and everything they had so casually forgotten. Trish finally leaned back on her palms and whistled again. You know what this is, right? She said. This isn't just a ledger, it's evidence. Janet looked up from her notepad, eyes calm but glinting with something harder underneath. It's Exhibit A. The sun had risen higher by the time Janet began rewriting the document for the third time. Her legal pad, once neat and orderly, now bore the chaotic marks of a mind unearthing decades. Scribbles crossed out, numbers recalculated, arrows redirected. This wasn't just arithmetic. It was storytelling, told through the cold, objective voice of receipts. Trish sat at the desk now, typing on her laptop with an intensity only former accountants could muster. Her glasses perched low, the glow of the screen making her silver hair gleam. Janet stood behind her, sipping black coffee that had long since gone cold. Make sure you include all the years I worked overtime so they could have name-brand shoes. That's a real number, not just a parent's sacrifice. Trish nodded without turning. Already have it listed as footwear inflation allowance, Nike tax, 1990 to 1999, $3,800, give or take. Janet chuckled dryly and shook her head. You're enjoying this too much. Trish glanced up. What can I say? Petty bookkeeping is still bookkeeping. They had spent hours combing through records, adding not just the tangible expenses but the overlooked ones, missed workdays for fevers, miles driven to and from music recitals, even the late-night pharmacy runs. But now, the tone was shifting, from forensic to surgical. They were carving out a history, line by precise line. Trish tapped a key and tilted the screen toward Janet. How's this for style? Taxi services? Unpaid. Ages 5 through 17? School drop-offs? Soccer practice? Band rehearsals? Birthday parties? $15,087. Janet laughed. Not a loud, amused laugh, but the kind that slipped out when disbelief meets bitter satisfaction. That's generous. I didn't charge them surge pricing for snow days. Trish smirked. Or for teenage attitude. Janet stepped back, her gaze tracing the page slowly. Add interest. Compounded. Let's say 3% per year. Trish raised an eyebrow. You want to get mathematical on them? They're the ones who called this business. Janet crossed her arms. Let's do the full audit. Trish typed with a little more force than necessary. Adding interest since each line item's purchase date. I hope their math grades were better than I remember. By late afternoon, the draft was finished. It was 16 pages long, footnoted, itemized, and bound together with a black binder clip. On the final page, in bold, sat the total. Total balance, due, $487,803.82. Janet stared at the number. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like math. Plain, honest math. The ledger had spoken. Now what? Trish asked, sliding her glasses onto her head. We let someone take a look, Janet said, already reaching for her phone. I want this to be bulletproof. An hour later, Alan Price sat across from them in the dining nook, flipping through the pages. He was a quiet man, mid-50s, with gentle eyes and a voice like a radio host's, calm, unhurried. The same lawyer who had helped settle Janet's late husband's estate 15 years ago. He knew her, and more importantly, he respected her. When he reached the final page, Alan leaned back and tapped the stack gently. This is impressive. I wasn't trying to impress, Janet said, her tone neutral. I was trying to quantify. He nodded, resting his hand on the invoice. Nothing here feels inflated. You documented everything, with evidence. And I've seen judges nod along to far less compelling argument. Trish grinned. She itemized love, Alan. No, Janet corrected quietly. I itemized labor. Alan regarded her for a moment, then set the stack down and folded his hands. If you're serious about this, I can formalize it. We can serve it properly, legally. Janet looked down at the binder, at every unpaid hour, every unacknowledged cost, every choice she'd made with love and sacrifice and silence. Then she met Alan's eyes. Let's make it official. The envelopes went out on a Monday morning. Trish insisted on using the thick, cream-colored paper reserved for wedding invitations and property closings. To set the tone, she said with a grin, sealing each one with a small gold sticker. The copies were couriered, not mailed. Janet had paid extra for signature-required delivery. Mark and Sophie would have to hold the weight of it in their hand. There would be no denying receipt. By Tuesday evening, the phone rang. Janet was folding towels in the laundry room when it buzzed in her pocket. Mark, flashing across the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice composed. Hello? You think this is funny? Mark barked, skipping hello entirely. Is this some kind of joke? Janet took a towel from the dryer and smoothed it across her arm. No, Mark, it's not. You sent me a bill for $500,000. His voice cracked like glass under pressure. You've lost your mind. I itemized the cost of raising 2 children, she said calmly, moving on to a fitted sheet. You sent me an invoice. I returned the courtesy. There was a stunned silence on the other end, like he hadn't expected her to be this unbothered. This isn't the same, and you know it, he snapped. We gave you a reasonable request. $1,200 a month, Mom. That's a bargain, Janet finished evenly, especially compared to what I fronted. You're being petty. No, she said, folding another towel. I'm being precise. Mark hung up. An hour later, Sophie called. Her voice was low and trembling, like someone who didn't quite know whether to cry or defend herself. Mom, is this real? Janet sat down on the edge of her bed and closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, sweetheart, it's very real. You kept all of it? Sophie asked. The receipts? The records? Every penny, Janet said softly. Every lunchbox? Every dentist visit? Every tank of gas to and from your field trips? Sophie didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, she whispered, I didn't know you still had all that. I wasn't holding it to use against you, Janet said. But since you decided to make parenting a transaction, I thought you deserved to see the full balance sheet. A muffled noise on the other end. Maybe a door closing. Maybe a hand pressed to her face. I didn't want this, Sophie whispered. But you allowed it, Janet said gently. That matters too. Just then, Trish stepped into the room holding 2 mugs of tea. How did Junior react? She asked as Janet ended the call. Janet took the cup and gave a half smile. Sputtering rage, then silence. Trish snorted, shaking her head. You want rent? You pay daycare first. Janet took a sip and let the warmth settle into her chest. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet companionable. Then Trish leaned forward. You sure about the next step? Janet nodded slowly. They thought a piece of paper could measure love. Fine. Let the court weigh it. The following morning, Alan Price filed a civil claim for reimbursement of familial investment and domestic labor. The packet was thick, detailed, and submitted with every supporting document attached. Receipts, notes, cost breakdowns, even interest calculations with reference dates. He emailed Janet a scanned copy of the stamped filing just after noon. She opened it at her kitchen table with the sunlight pouring over her shoulder and the scent of lemon cleaner still lingering in the air from her morning chores. Her name, bold at the top as plaintiff. Her children's names below it, not in her handwriting for once, but typed and framed by the cold lines of legal format. It was surreal, but it felt just. She looked at Trish, who sat across from her nibbling on a biscotti. It's done. Trish raised her mug. Cheers to weaponized accounting. Janet didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she stared at the document and wondered how long it would take before the world found out. The story broke before the shock had even settled. By Thursday morning, the clerk's office had posted the civil claim on the public docket, and by noon, it had been picked up by a small legal blog that specialized in unusual filing. Alan had warned Janet this might happen. Family lawsuits had a way of leaking, and a mother suing her adult children was catnip for attention. The call from Mark came in that afternoon, seething and red-hot. You've lost your goddamn mind. Janet put him on speaker and continued organizing her files into labeled dividers, her fingertips brushing lightly over the clear plastic sleeves as she worked. Trish sat nearby, sipping club soda like she was front row at a theater. You think you're going to get $500,000 out of us? Mark was shouting. What do you want, Mom? Headlines? A Netflix deal? Janet didn't flinch. I want what you said you valued. Fairness. This isn't fairness, he spat. This is revenge. She picked up a receipt from a 1998 orthodontist visit and slid it neatly into its tabbed section. This is an invoice, like the one you gave me. Trish reached over and muted the speaker for a moment. You think he'd be this outraged if she'd just left him out of the will quietly? She whispered. Men can't handle being itemized. Janet's lips twitched, but her voice remained level as she turned the speaker back on. I can't believe you're doing this, Mark continued, breathing hard. You're making us look like monsters. You did that when you put a price tag on motherhood, she said calmly. I just adjusted for inflation. He hung up before she could finish the sentence. Sophie's call came later that evening, shaky and breathless. Mom, she said. What are you doing? Janet paused. I'm preparing. This'll never stand in court. A judge is going to laugh you out of the room. Don't you see how crazy this looks? Janet let the silence settle long enough to be uncomfortable. I don't expect to win money, she said softly. That was never the point, but I will be heard. On record. By someone impartial. But this is public now, Sophie whispered, panicked. People are already sharing the case online. I've had coworkers send me screenshots. They're calling you a hero. Or a lunatic. Janet's eyes wandered across the stacks of binders spread across her bed, each one methodically labeled. Medical, education, transportation, extracurriculars, emotional labor, unbilled. I know what I am, Janet said. And I know what I've done. Sophie didn't reply, just soft breathing on the line, and then a quiet click. The next morning, Janet and Trish sat across from Alan in his law office, a clean, sunlit space just off downtown Phoenix, with framed degrees and two polished wood bookshelves that smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust. Alan flipped through the final packet one last time. It had taken days to assemble, and Janet had color-coded the attachments by decade. Each receipt, affidavit, and calendar note had been scanned and logged. Every expense was dated, cross-referenced, annotated. Trish had even created a visual graph. This, Alan said, leaning back and setting the file gently on the desk, is the tightest invoice I've ever seen in my career. Janet looked down at her hands. They were still, unshaking. I'm not doing this to humiliate them, she said. I want the record to exist, even if no one pays a cent. I want it written in ink. Alan nodded slowly. Judges don't laugh at evidence, especially when it's this clean. Trish grinned and gave Janet's knee a quick pat. And if they do laugh, it'll be nervously. He reached for a stamped envelope. It's filed. Now we wait for a hearing date. Janet took a long breath and looked out the window. Below, cars rolled past in slow, steady motion, indifferent to the storm she'd just set into motion. I've waited 68 years, she said quietly. I can wait a few more weeks. Alan stood. Just be ready. Once this hits the courtroom, it won't just be your family watching. Janet looked him in the eye. I'm counting on it. The first article appeared on a Friday morning. It wasn't in a national outlet, just a local paper. The Phoenix Sentinel, buried midway through their human interest section. The headline was snide, the tone worse. Mom sues kids for $500,000 in back pay for being a parent. Beneath it, a blurry photo of Janet walking into Alan's office, manila folder in hand, her face mid-expression, caught between calm and steely. Trish slammed the newspaper down on the kitchen counter, coffee sloshing over the edge of her mug. He went to the press. Janet didn't need to ask who he was. Mark's fingerprints were all over it. The quotes were too polished, too performative. We love our mother, but this feels like punishment. She never asked for help, and now she's coming after us like we're strangers. It's just sad. Trish read aloud in disgust. He paints you like some deranged old woman obsessed with receipts and revenge. Janet took the paper, folded it once with surgical care, and set it aside. Let him talk. That afternoon, the same paper requested an interview. Janet agreed. On her terms. She wore a light gray blouse and her wedding ring, still polished, still meaningful, and met the reporter at a shaded bench outside a local coffee shop. She brought no binders, no props, just her voice. The young journalist, probably not much older than Sophie had been when she graduated college, asked softly, "What are you hoping to get out of this, Mrs. Collins?" Janet smiled without warmth. A record. A reckoning. Call it a line in the ledger. The journalist blinked. You kept the receipts? Of course I did, Janet replied. When you love someone, you keep the proof. The photos, the report card, the dentist bills, the little things no one sees, because no one thinks to look. And you think it's fair to put a price on motherhood? Janet tilted her head. I didn't set the price. My children did. I just did the math. The article dropped online that evening, and by the next morning, it had been reposted over 1,000 times. Mother Math started trending regionally. Memes popped up. Janet's photo next to Excel spreadsheet, satirical pie charts showing emotional labor, 99.9%. And then came the comments. Some brutal, some awestruck. She's bitter. She's brilliant. Finally, someone's putting a number to what women give. Entitled boomers at it again? I'd pay my mom if she ever asked. I sent my mom flowers. These people sent her a bill. Janet didn't read most of them. She didn't need to. She only looked at the emails forwarded by Alan, people offering support, others sharing their own quiet parental sacrifices. One woman sent a photo of her own binder from the 80s, labeled household stuff, filled with ledgers and notes. "You're viral, you know," Trish said one evening, scrolling through her tablet with one eyebrow raised. "You're internet famous. People are calling you the bookkeeper mom." Janet raised her eyebrows as she chopped vegetables for dinner. "How flattering." "There's a podcast request, and 2 local news stations want to do interviews." "I'm not a circus act," Janet replied. "Let them talk. I'll talk in court." Trish leaned against the counter. Still, must feel a little satisfying, getting the last word. Janet paused mid-chop and looked out the window. The yard was overgrown again. Mark had stopped tending it weeks ago. "They wanted a spotlight," she said. "Let's see how it feels when it's pointed back at them." Across town, Sophie had deactivated her Facebook account and silenced her phone. She hadn't left the house in 3 days. The headlines made her stomach twist. She couldn't open her email without seeing her mother's name in the subject lines. And Mark? Mark doubled down. He posted a carefully worded statement about privacy and painful family matters and trust being broken. But behind the scenes, he was calling lawyers of his own. Janet knew it, and she was ready. One afternoon, as she and Trish sat side by side on the patio, sipping cold tea and flipping through old photo albums for courtroom exhibit, Trish tapped a page with her pinky. "That one," she said. "The Christmas photo with the sled. You can see the exhaustion in your face." "I remember that year," Janet said softly. "Mark had pneumonia, Sophie was teething, and I still stayed up until 2 a.m. building that damn sled." Trish closed the album gently. "They have no idea who they picked a fight with." Janet turned her face toward the sun, unflinching. "They will." The courtroom was already buzzing when Janet arrived. A low, electric hum of curiosity ran through the crowd. Murmurs, sidelong glances, the subtle shuffle of feet and phones. The case had drawn more attention than anyone expected. Reporters occupied the back rows, their notepads ready, while a few early birds from the neighborhood whispered excitedly in the corner pews. The bailiff stood tall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the packed gallery like a bouncer at a high-end lounge. Janet stepped through the heavy doors with Alan by her side, Trish just behind them like a silent anchor. The air inside felt cooler than it should have. Institutional, dry, everything beige and oak and fluorescent. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, spine straight, her breath slow and deliberate. Alan pulled out the binder, organizing the tabs she'd so carefully labeled. She'd done this in her sleep the night before, filing, revising, checking numbers. But now it wasn't about paper, it was about posture. Across the aisle, Mark sat fidgeting, his fingers twitching near his phone even though the bailiff had warned everyone to silence them. He looked agitated, overdressed, and deeply uncomfortable. Sophie, by contrast, looked small, almost ghostly. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, her posture slouched. She didn't look at Janet, didn't look at the judge's bench. Her gaze stayed down. The side door creaked open. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Harriet Monroe stepped through, black robe flowing, her face unreadable but commanding. Every murmur dropped to silence. She nodded once and sat. "You may be seated." Her voice was even, clipped, unamused. Alan stood first. "Good morning, Your Honor." Alan Price for the plaintiff, Mrs. Janet Collins. The judge gave a quick nod, already reviewing the folder in front of her. "Defense?" A younger man, Mark's attorney, stood awkwardly and introduced himself. The name forgettable, his tone rushed. Mark didn't stand with him. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw clenched like a child sent to the principal's office. The judge glanced between the 2 tables. "I understand this case has generated public interest," she said, clearly unimpressed. "But let me be clear. This is a courtroom, not a stage. I will hear the facts, not the drama. Understood?" Alan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Mark's attorney nodded as well. "Of course." The judge turned to Janet. "Mrs. Collins, you're the plaintiff. You may begin." Janet rose slowly, the motion deliberate, every eye in the room now fixed on her. She took one small stack of documents from the file and stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the linoleum floor. "I've brought itemized documentation of over 30 years of financial, Emotional and physical labor, she said evenly. Not theory, not opinion, just numbers, receipts, and facts. Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow. Proceed. As Janet handed the exhibit packet to the bailiff, Mark shifted suddenly, throwing his arms out in disbelief. This is ridiculous, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. She's turning parenting into a lawsuit. Judge Monroe didn't even look up. Mr. Collins, if you speak again without being addressed, you'll be held in contempt. Sophie sat perfectly still beside him, eyes locked on her lap, her face burning with something between shame and disbelief. Janet returned to her seat, voice calm, eyes clear. They billed me for living in my son's guest room, she said. This is my reply. Judge Monroe looked through the packet, skimming the first few pages. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just nodded once, slowly, as if she were scanning a balance sheet and finding no errors. I'll review all documentation in detail, she said, but on first glance, it appears organized, annotated, and thorough. She set the papers down and leaned slightly forward. You're not here to win a check, are you, Mrs. Collins? Janet met her eyes without flinching. I'm here to make the cost visible. A ripple moved through the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. Trish leaned closer and whispered behind her hand. She's listening. Janet didn't blink. Good. The courtroom was smaller than Janet had imagined, almost intimate, like a waiting room with pews. But it was full. People whispered as she entered. Not just family or reporters, but neighbors, office clerks, and strangers drawn in by the viral headlines and hashtags. One woman in the back wore a shirt that said, "Motherhood is labor," in bold letters. Trish nudged Janet's arm and gave a little smile. Janet didn't return it. She walked steadily, heels echoing against the tile as she approached the plaintiff's table. Alan stood and nodded to her, already flipping through the annotated exhibit tab. The binder was there. Exhibit A, resting beside a portable file box color-coded by decade. Across the aisle, Mark sat stiff in a navy suit he hadn't worn since his friend's wedding 3 years ago. His tie was crooked. Sophie sat beside him, pale and visibly uncomfortable, clutching a tissue in her lap. She hadn't met Janet's eye once since they'd entered. Judge Harriet Monroe entered like a closing door, calm, firm, without fanfare. 63, hair swept into a no-nonsense bun, eyes like polished steel. She sat behind the bench, surveyed the courtroom, and adjusted her glasses. Case 2084 PR, the clerk announced. Collins v. Collins. Allen stood. Your Honor, thank you for hearing us. We're here today to present financial documentation of unpaid, unrecognized domestic labor provided over a period of 35 years. My client seeks acknowledgement and, where appropriate, compensation. Judge Monroe raised one eyebrow. Let's see what you've brought me. Janet rose slowly, spine straight. She picked up the binder, walked toward the bench, and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it along. She spoke only once she saw the judge open the first page. I itemized the cost of raising 2 children, Your Honor. Not just the money, but the time, the labor, the choices I made instead of choosing myself. I was sent an invoice for rent on my 68th birthday. This is my reply. The judge flipped through the first few pages. Her expression remained unreadable. Alan followed, placing photocopies on the evidence cart. We've organized everything chronologically: groceries, school supplies, medical expenses, car insurance, extracurriculars. Interest? The judge asked, her tone dry. Compounded annually, Janet said before Alan could respond. At 3%. Modest. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Trish, in the front row, beamed like a proud coach watching her star player score in overtime. Mark suddenly stood, unable to keep still. This is ridiculous, he burst out. She's making a spectacle. What parent sends their kids a bill for being raised? Judge Monroe didn't even look up. Sit down, Mr. Collins. But I said sit. Mark's jaw clenched as he dropped back into his seat. Sophie flinched at the sound of the gavel. The judge continued reading in silence. After a long pause, she turned to Janet. You kept all these receipts? I did, Janet said. Not out of spite, out of habit, out of responsibility. The judge tapped a line with her pen. Braces, $1,180. 1991 marks, Janet replied. College tuition, $18,000. Paid in full? Sophie's first 2 years at Northern Arizona. utilities, grocery budgets, car repairs, school yearbooks, soccer uniforms, birthday parties, broken wrists, flu shots. It was all there. A soft rustle moved through the courtroom. No one could say a word. They didn't need to. The proof was stacked 2 inches high and 3 decades wide. Janet looked toward the back row. The same woman in the Motherhood is Labor shirt gave her a discreet nod. Another man, maybe mid-40s, wiped his eyes. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, staring at the polished floor like it might rescue her. Mark had gone quiet. Janet looked back at the judge. They asked me to quantify love, she said softly. I couldn't, but I could quantify labor. I did what any responsible bookkeeper would do. She took a breath. They sent me a bill, I replied. The courtroom was still when the financial evaluator took the stand. Elena Ramirez was in her early 50s, composed in a slate blue blazer, hair pulled back into a low bun, her reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose. She spoke with the steady confidence of someone who had balanced ledgers in bankruptcy court, IRS audits, and more than a few ugly divorces. This wasn't her first family war. She adjusted the microphone, glanced at the judge, and began. I was asked to review a comprehensive file submitted by the plaintiff, Janet Collins, she said. The file contained over 300 receipts, statements, and financial records dating from 1980 to 2010. And your conclusion? Judge Monroe asked. The calculations are consistent, Elena replied. In fact, I'd say they're exceptionally meticulous. Her totals, adjusted for inflation and modest compounded interest, fall within a reasonable range of estimated household contributions for a single caregiver. Mark shifted sharply in his chair. You're saying it's accurate? The judge asked, her voice flat. Yes, Elena said. To the decimal. Mark stood suddenly. This is absurd. She kept grocery receipts for 30 years and now we're supposed to call that legal debt? The judge turned her head slowly toward him. Mr. Collins, sit down. I mean, what kind of person hoards that stuff unless they're planning something? He snapped. Judge Monroe didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. One more outburst and you'll be escorted out. That's your final warning. Mark dropped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Janet sat still, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her expression hadn't changed since the hearing began. Focused, restrained. But her eyes, those were different now. They weren't angry or proud. They were clear, unburdened. Judge Monroe leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. I've reviewed the document. I've heard from a neutral evaluator. This court recognizes that the plaintiff's claim is valid, not necessarily enforceable in the traditional civil sense, but valid in its intent, detail, and spirit. A collective murmur rippled through the room. The judge held up a hand. Let me be very clear. This is a symbolic judgment, not a financial ruling. The law does not currently allow a parent to recoup retroactive costs of raising their children, but precedent exists for acknowledging debt in moral terms. Emotional labor, domestic contributions, these are real, if often invisible. She paused, letting that sink in. Accordingly, I'm ordering a formal written apology to the plaintiff from both defendants, publicly read into the court record. Mark scoffed. This is a circus. The judge didn't blink. You're welcome to leave, Mr. Collins, but your name will still be on that apology. He shoved his chair backward so hard it screeched against the tile. Several people flinched. Sophie reached out instinctively to stop him, but he yanked his arm away and stormed out through the rear doors, letting them slam behind him. No one moved. Sophie remained seated, motionless. Her eyes were red. Her hands trembled in her lap. For a long moment it seemed she might follow her brother. But then she stood, shaky but upright. I'd like to read mine now, she said quietly. The courtroom hushed. Alan handed her the single sheet. She took it with both hands, unfolded it carefully, and turned toward the judge. Her voice cracked on the second sentence. To our mother, Janet Collins, she began, we failed to honor the cost of your love, your time, your sacrifice. We treated it as owed, not earned. And when we had the chance to care for you, we chose convenience over respect. Tears slipped down her face. She didn't wipe them. You gave us everything without asking. We asked for too much, too late. She looked up, directly at Janet. I'm sorry, Mom, for the rent, for the silence, for going along with him when I should have stood up for you. Janet's throat was tight. She said nothing for a long time. She only stared at her daughter. This adult woman who had once clung to her hand at the zoo, who had cried over scraped knees and college rejection letters. The apology hung between them like fog. Finally, Janet nodded once. Not forgiven, she said gently, but noted. It took less than 24 hours. The same reporter who had once called Janet, the woman suing her kids for being a mom, now ran a different story altogether. This time, the headline was sharper, bolder. Court recognizes cost of motherhood in historic moral ruling, and beneath it, a photo of Janet exiting the courthouse. Same gray blouse, same calm expression, but this time, the caption read, Janet Collins, the bookkeeper who balanced the scales. By noon, it was everywhere. News alerts, reaction videos, hashtags spiraling out across platforms, TikToks reenacting Sophie's courtroom apology, Twitter threads quoting the judge's ruling like scripture. A side-by-side image of Janet's invoice and her son's rent demand had already become a meme, titled simply, Receipts, Regret. Mark, for all his PR instincts, had badly misjudged the climate. People were not laughing with him, they were laughing at him. Imagine charging your mom rent and ending up on the wrong side of history. Congrats to Janet Collins for creating the worst Mother's Day guilt trip of all time and earning it. Mark Collins, the rent son. That one stuck. Rent son started trending before sunset. Commenters unearthed his LinkedIn, Yelp reviews, even a 2-star Etsy shop he'd tried to launch during the pandemic. Screenshots of his original press quotes now appeared under the words, "This aged like milk." He deleted his Facebook by morning. Meanwhile, Sophie tried to vanish in real life. She took time off work citing family matters, stayed home with the blinds drawn, and stopped checking her phone entirely. She didn't answer Janet's texts, though Janet didn't expect her to. Humiliation, unlike justice, wasn't linear. Janet sat at her kitchen table, sorting through her mail with a quiet steadiness. The counter had become its own archive, stacks of envelopes from strangers across the country. Handwritten letters, folded cards, even one laminated note from a retired postal worker in Illinois. You made me feel seen, one woman wrote. I raised 3 sons who never said thank you, but you showed the world what that cost. My daughter just sent me a check for $500 and said, for the groceries in '96? I cried. Some of them came with return addresses. Janet wrote back when she could. Not because she needed to, because she understood what silence cost. Trish came by most mornings now, armed with scones, tea, and fresh gossip. They're already making a podcast, she said one Tuesday, sliding her iPad across the table. Modern Matriarchs, Episode 1, The Invoice. Your folklore now. Janet didn't flinch. She stirred her tea, unbothered. They're even pitching a documentary, Trish added. Netflix. You'll have to wear makeup. Janet finally looked up. If I'd known my skin would be analyzed in 4K, I'd have charged cosmetic labor on the invoice. Trish barked out a laugh. That's the spirit. Janet took another sip, her fingers resting lightly against the porcelain rim. Her eyes drifted out the window, where the garden, once overgrown and neglected, had begun to bloom again. Sophie's daughter had come by with wildflower seeds and helped her plant them, quietly, without questions. They think I won? Janet said softly. Trish tilted her head. Didn't you? Janet gave the faintest smile. I didn't want to win. I wanted them to feel it. The weight. The reckoning. A knock interrupted her thought. Alan stood at the door, envelope in hand, his face unreadable. Janet opened it slowly. Inside, a letter from the Arizona Daily Ledger, requesting her written approval for syndication of her court testimony. A feature titled The Cost of Love was set to run in papers across 12 states. Janet folded the letter once, neatly, and set it on the table. Trish raised her brows. You're not going to say yes? Janet didn't answer. She poured more tea, watched the steam rise like breath in cold air. Then she said, so quietly Trish almost didn't hear. They want to hear what I said in court. A long pause. I haven't decided what I'll say next. The studio lights were warmer than Janet expected. They softened everything. Her skin, the room, even the nerves buzzing under her blouse. She sat in the center chair of a 3-person panel beneath a glowing backdrop that read, Today in America. The makeup artist had dabbed her cheeks with powder, smoothed her silver hair back with a soft brush, and whispered, "You're going to be great, Miss Collins," before slipping out of frame. Janet wasn't sure what great meant anymore. She was just here to finish what had already started. The host, Vanessa Byrne, leaned in with that perfect balance of empathy and hunger only a seasoned national anchor could pull off. "You've had quite the few weeks, Janet," Vanessa said, her voice bright but measured. "Millions have read your story. Thousands have shared your invoice. And now, you're here. Not as a viral headline, but as the woman behind it." Janet gave a small nod, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap. "I never expected to be here," she said. "I just wanted to be heard." "And now you're on every major network," Vanessa said with a smile. "Why do you think this resonated with so many people?" Janet thought for a moment before answering. "Because I didn't scream. I calculated. And because every mother in America, every caregiver really, has had a moment where they wondered quietly what their love had cost them." The audience was still. No coughing, no shuffling, just breath held. Vanessa tilted her head. "And when your son asked you to pay rent?" Janet smiled thinly. "I replied with a bill of my own." Soft laughter from the audience. Then, from somewhere in the second row, a clap. Then another. Until applause rippled through the room like wind through dry leaves. Vanessa let it swell before raising her hand. "And you've said before, you weren't trying to get money. You were trying to make the labor visible." Janet nodded. "Love doesn't need repayment, but labor deserves recognition. If children can assign cost to a parent's presence, then it's only fair we assign cost to our years of absence, foregone income, sleepless nights, lost time." She paused, letting the words breathe. "Eh. If kids can charge parents rent," Janet said slowly, "then parents can charge for raising them." The audience erupted. Applause thundered now, not polite, but visceral. Somewhere, a woman shouted, "Yes!" and another added, "Tell it, Mama." Janet smiled faintly, not proud, not smug, just still. The segment trended before the end of the broadcast. Clips flooded social media, stitched beside videos of caregivers scrubbing floors, nursing infants, holding down 2 jobs while managing homework at the kitchen table. The quote went viral: "If kids can charge rent, parents can charge for raising them." By nightfall, Janet's face was splashed across every major outlet from coast to coast. But not everyone applauded. Miles away, in a quiet apartment surrounded by closed curtains and silence, Mark watched the clip from his laptop, his jaw clenched tighter with each word. The applause felt like knives, the laughter like a verdict. He slammed the lid shut, knocking over a half-empty soda can. It splattered across the floor. "She made us into a punchline," he muttered. "She made me into a joke." He reached for his phone, paused, and tossed it across the couch. It vibrated once, then again, then went still. Sophie didn't respond to the clip at all. She didn't repost it, didn't comment, didn't like or share. She simply watched in silence, earbuds in, her face unreadable. She watched Janet speak with clarity and calm, watched the audience erupt, watched her mother become something larger than a parent, something almost mythic. Then she closed her laptop and stared out the window. Back in Phoenix, Trish sat beside Janet on the couch, legs tucked under her, sipping wine. "Well?" Trish said, nudging her with an elbow. "First court, now national television. What's next? Hollywood?" Janet didn't laugh. She lifted her glass, looked into the flickering candlelight and said, "Not Hollywood." She took a sip. "But a stage." The ballroom was nothing like a courtroom or a television studio. It was larger, warmer, washed in golden lighting and the hum of soft jazz drifting from overhead speakers. Round tables filled the floor, each draped in navy linen and circled by chairs occupied by social workers, elder rights advocates, community organizers, and policy researchers in tweed jackets and sensible shoes. At the front of the room, a wide stage glowed under recessed spotlights. A single podium stood center, flanked by 2 tall screens. One displayed her name, Janet Collins, keynote speaker. The other, unseen, unpaid, unforgotten, the value of care. Janet stood behind the curtain, her hands resting on the sides of her tailored blazer, exhaling slowly as Trish adjusted the microphone pin to her lapel. "You look 10 years younger," Trish said, smoothing a thread on Janet's sleeve. Janet smiled faintly. "That's because I'm not carrying 10 years of silence." She stepped onto the stage to a respectful murmur of applause, Not the roar of daytime TV, but something more reverent, more grounded. These were people who understood systems, statistics, human cost, and they were already leaning in. The lights dimmed. On the screen behind her, the first image appeared. A faded invoice. Room and board invoice. $1,200. Dated. Her 68th birthday. I received this on what should have been an ordinary evening, Janet began, her voice steady, low, clear. It was my birthday. There was cake, there was family, and there was a bill for rent. Gasps scattered through the room. She clicked to the next slide. Her own reply: childcare, meals, medical expenses, 1980 to 2010. Total due: $487,803.82. I didn't respond with rage, she said. I responded with a ledger, with math, with memory. A soft current of murmurs swelled beneath the surface. She let it settle before continuing. What I sent them wasn't a demand. It was a reminder that love may be given freely, but time, labor, and dignity cannot be dismissed without cost. Applause broke out then. Not polite, but genuine. A few heads nodded so hard it looked like relief. Behind the applause, in the dimly lit back row, sat a woman with her coat clutched tightly across her chest. Sophie, hair pulled into a low twist. No makeup. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't blink. She hadn't planned to come. Hadn't RSP, but she'd arrived 10 minutes late and slipped in unnoticed, drawn by something heavier than guilt, something closer to awe. On stage, Janet was in control. No cue cards, no teleprompter, just lived experience, sharpened into conviction. They told me I'd gone too far, Janet said. But women are always told that when they cross the line, others pretend doesn't exist. When we ask to be seen, not just needed. The screens shifted again, this time to a collage of photos, her itemized binder, court transcripts, screenshots of news headlines, and letters from other caregivers who had written to her. Your story gave me permission, one read. You reminded me I'm not invisible. You gave us the language. Applause rose again, louder this time. Some stood. A few wiped tears. Trish, sitting near the front, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered, "Revenge comes with applause now." Janet stepped away from the podium, not smiling, not basking, just quiet, whole. In the shadows, Sophie's shoulders trembled. Her mouth moved slightly, words meant only for herself. "Mom." But Janet didn't look back. Not yet. She descended the steps, moving past the sea of people rising to their feet. No rush, no theatrics, just a woman who had kept every receipt and finally delivered them in full. And outside, waiting under the glow of a nearby street lamp, a woman in a gray coat lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, then put it out immediately. She wasn't ready, but she was getting closer. The legal office was quiet, thicker, then silent, really. It was the kind of hush reserved for inheritance meetings, life insurance signatures, and the unspoken weight of consequence. Janet sat at the polished table with her reading glasses perched low and a cup of chamomile tea cooling in front of her. The window behind Alan's desk looked out onto a row of oak trees, their autumn leaves flickering amber and rust like paper on fire. Alan slid the draft across the desk. This version reflects your changes, line by line. Janet didn't reach for it. Not yet. She looked at him instead. No loopholes? She asked. Alan shook his head gently. None. It's clean. It's final. It's bulletproof. She nodded, then flipped open the packet. The pages were crisp and tidy, each clause clear. Legal, but not impersonal. Mark's name was gone. Not crossed out. Not reduced. Gone. He had billed her for rent. Now she'd made that charge eternal. Instead of his name, a line now read, "No inheritance shall be passed to any descendant who seeks compensation from the testator for acts of domestic care, housing, or emotional labor provided freely in good faith." Sophie's name remained, but modestly, a conditional inheritance, enough to reflect her apology without absolving the silence that preceded it. To Sophie Collins, $10,000, disbursed upon signed affidavit confirming respect for the deceased and acknowledgement of harm caused. But the majority? Redirected. Page 3 outlined it in bold. 80% of all residual assets shall be donated to St. Agnes Pediatric Hospital. Emergency Fund, Larchwood Community Senior Center, Caregiver Support Program. Two places Janet had relied on, quietly, without fanfare, during the leanest years of raising her children. One had treated Mark's asthma when she couldn't afford ER fees. The other had given her the only adult conversation she'd had some weeks during Sophie's infancy. "This isn't spite," Janet said softly. "I know," Alan replied. "It's intention." Janet closed the folder and rested her hand on top of it. "I'm tired of passing down silence. They made the rules. I just played by them. With receipts." Alan gave a small smile. "You sure you don't want to leave a note for them? Something final?" Janet considered that. The theater of it, the temptation. "No," she said. "The paper trail speaks louder." Alan leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "I've worked estate law for 30 years, he said. "Most wills come from fear. Of dying. Of being forgotten. Yours came from clarity. And a spreadsheet." Janet smiled faintly. "You can thank Trish for the spreadsheet." As if on cue, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A message from Trish lit up the screen. "Got the petition signature. They want you on the advisory board. The hospital too. You ready to be a legacy?" Janet turned the phone over without replying. She wasn't looking for legacy. She was looking for accuracy. She signed the final page with clean, unshaking strokes. Alan stamped the notary seal, then reached for the duplicate copies. "One for your records, one filed." Janet tucked her copy into her leather bag. He looked at her, gently now. "Do you feel at peace?" She stood slowly, buttoned her coat, and lifted her bag to her shoulder. "I feel documented." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "He billed me," she said quietly, without turning back. "I billed him forever." And then she left. Back at home, the house was still. A stack of mail waited on the table. Mostly junk. One manila envelope stood out. No return address, but postmarked from Sophie's city. Janet opened it slowly. Inside, a short letter, written in familiar cursive. "Mom, I won't ask for forgiveness, but I'm trying to raise my daughter without asking her for a single thing she didn't offer freely. I hope you'd be proud of that. Love, Sophie." Janet stood there, staring at the page for a long time. Her tea went cold on the counter. Her bag slipped from her shoulder and landed softly on the floor. She didn't cry, but she whispered something into the quiet, something that sounded almost like, "Good." It was raining again. The kind of late autumn rain that didn't shout, just whispered steadily, politely, as if asking to be let in. Janet stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching it stripe the glass in thin vertical lines. She could hear the hum of the kettle behind her, faint jazz on the old radio, and the creak of floorboards near the front door. She didn't turn around, but she knew who it was. Sophie stood in the entryway, soaked from the walk up the drive, a paper bag held protectively to her chest. "I brought soup," she said. Janet nodded once. "You're dripping." "I didn't park close." There was a long pause, and then Janet said, without facing her, "Towels are in the hall closet. Same shelf as always." By the time Sophie returned, hair towel dried, jacket slung over a chair, Janet had set the table for two. Not fancy, not ceremonial, just bowls, spoons, napkins, and silence. They sat. Neither touched the soup. Sophie looked older than she had last time, not in her face, still soft, still framed by strands of windswept hair, but in the way she sat, the slight hunch, the way her fingers laced and unlaced themselves like they were stalling. "I owe you more than a letter," she said. Janet didn't answer. Sophie looked down at her hands. "I wasn't proud of what we did. I was just scared to question it. Mark always made everything sound so rational, so justified, like we were doing the responsible thing." Her voice cracked. "I wanted to believe that made us good." "You wanted to believe it made you safe," Janet said quietly. Sophie nodded, tears already streaking down her cheeks. "I didn't stand up for you. I stood beside him. I stood in the silence." She took a shaky breath. "I was jealous too. You were always so certain, even when things were hard. I resented that." Janet's gaze stayed fixed on her daughter's face, unreadable. "I told myself you didn't need anything, that you were fine, that you didn't mind." Janet blinked slowly. "But I did." Sophie sobbed once, sharp and sudden. I know you did." The room filled with the sound of rain again, punctuated by the quiet clink of a spoon, as Sophie stirred her untouched soup just to keep her hands busy. "I've been trying to be better," she whispered. "With my daughter. with myself. I read your invoice more times than I'll admit. Every time I feel like skipping a school play or rolling my eyes at a tantrum, I think of you, of how you showed up. Janet exhaled, not bitterly, but heavily, like something long buried had been disturbed, not excavated. You disappointed me? She said finally. Sophie nodded, bracing herself. But, Janet added, disappointment isn't destiny. Sophie looked up. You can change, Janet said. You've started to. A beat passed. Then Sophie stood and crossed the small space between them. She bent down, arms trembling, and wrapped her mother in the kind of hug that didn't come quickly or neatly. It was hesitant, messy, desperate, and accepted. Janet let her. Her arms came up slowly, deliberately, resting around her daughter's shoulders like someone remembering how. Not with forgiveness, but with presence. When they pulled apart, Sophie wiped her eyes and gave a watery laugh. Do you want the soup reheated? Janet glanced at the clock. Might be cold by now. I don't mind. I'll get the kettle, Janet said. As she stood, Trish appeared in the doorway, umbrella still dripping in one hand, an eyebrow raised. Am I interrupting something tender? Sophie gave a small smile. Janet rolled her eyes and moved toward the stove. Looks like someone cried on your cardigan, Trish said as she passed. Janet didn't bother to check. It's just broth. Trish settled into the third chair with a soft grunt, eyeing Sophie with half curiosity, half approval. One down, she muttered, nodding toward Sophie. One gone. Janet didn't reply. She just poured water into the kettle and struck the match. The flame caught instantly and stayed. The sun broke through the clouds just before the ribbon was cut. It had rained all morning, light, persistent showers that tapped umbrellas and slicked the walkway outside the newly renovated West Wing of St. Agnes Pediatric Hospital. But now, as if on cue, the gray thinned. Warm light spilled across the lawn, catching on the polished brass plaque mounted beside the entry. Janet stood to the side of the podium in a navy wool coat, hair pinned back neatly, heels just low enough not to hurt. Trish hovered nearby with a camera slung over one shoulder and a glass of sparkling cider in the other. A modest crowd had gathered. Hospital staff, local press, a few familiar city council faces, and, most notably, the families. Dozens of them. Parents holding the hands of small, tired children, nurses smiling from behind their masks. One boy in a red hoodie with a taped-up inhaler grinned and waved at Janet like she was royalty. She offered him a quiet nod in return. An administrator, tall, soft-spoken, grateful, stepped to the microphone. Today we honor not just a gift, but a philosophy, she said. Ms. Collins didn't ask for recognition. She asked us to remember the cost of invisible labor, of sacrifice, of love disguised as duty. She turned slightly, motioning toward the wall behind her. And thanks to her donation, this new family housing wing will support hundreds of caregivers, giving them the rest, privacy, and dignity they've so often gone without. A nurse tugged gently on a velvet cloth. The plaque was revealed, etched in gold. In honor of mothers who gave everything donated by Janet Collins, 2025. Applause rose, gentle at first, then strong. Janet didn't cry, but she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound pass through her like light through glass. Sophie stood toward the back, just under the awning. She wore a gray trench coat and simple flats, a small smile curving her lips, not beaming, not performative, just present. When their eyes met across the crowd, Sophie's chin lifted slightly, not in defiance, in acknowledgement. She didn't move closer, didn't wave, but the message was clear. I see it now, and I see you. Trish slid up beside Janet, lowering her voice. You realize you're one plaque away from sainthood, right? Janet gave a soft snort. God help the canonizer. Trish leaned in. Mark's name came up again. Someone online said he tried applying for a consulting job last week. Didn't go well. Janet didn't answer. She didn't need to. Mark was absent, of course. His reputation had become its own currency, spent too quickly, never replenished. His version of the story had long since drowned in the echo of receipts and reckoning. One nurse approached shyly, holding a clipboard. Ms. Collins, she said, I know you're probably being pulled in a dozen directions, but my mom's a caregiver too. And she just wanted me to say thank you, from both of us. Janet placed a hand over the nurse's gently. Tell her I said the books are balanced now. The crowd thinned over the next hour. Families trickled out. Administrators returned to their offices. The catering staff began gathering the empty glasses and discarded napkins. Janet lingered. She stood beside the plaque once more, fingertips grazing the edge of the inscription. She didn't touch the name, her name, but the words above it. Mothers who gave everything. It wasn't self-congratulation, it was memory. It was record. It was the invoice paid. Trish appeared at her side again, this time holding 2 champagne flutes. She handed one over. To justice, she said, raising her glass. Janet clinked hers gently. To clarity. They sipped, standing in easy silence. Then, after a moment, Janet chuckled softly. What? Trish asked. Janet turned toward her, eyes sparkling. On my birthday, she said, my kids gave me a bill for rent, so I gave them an invoice for their entire childhood. Trish burst out laughing. And this time, so did Janet. Not bitter, not triumphant, just free.